You know that look when someone asks a question and it feels like the world just paused for a moment? That was me sitting alone at Cedar Grove Living Center, staring at a pile of paperwork taller than my silver 2014 Ford F-15. Oh, back home. Medicare forms, trust modifications, medical directives, all waiting for me. And then Evelyn Pierce, the kind clerk with a peppermint-colored cardigan and a knowing smile, asked softly, "Mr. Long, why are you here alone? I want you to picture it. My children Derek and Megan had promised a quick trip to grab lunch. 3 hours later, I'm the only adult in the room, surrounded by a fortress of legal papers, and suddenly I realized they didn't just leave me. They thought they'd left an old man confused, defenseless. But here's the twist. What they didn't know is that this old man spent 32 years uncovering fraud, reading fine print, and spotting lies before anyone even said signature. Before I tell you what happens next, I'm curious. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. And hey, if you like stories like this, consider subscribing. Stick around. Things are about to get interesting. That morning started like 100 other mornings I'd lived through in Des Moines. Quiet. Cold enough to make your knees complain a little when you stepped outside, but not cold enough for gloves. Early October in Iowa has a smell to it. Dry leaves, damp pavement, and somebody somewhere already burning wood in a fireplace they absolutely do not need yet. I remember because I stood in my driveway for a full minute staring at my silver 2014 Ford F-150 while holding a styrofoam cup of coffee from the Hy-Vee gas station on Grand Avenue. Black coffee. No sugar. At 68 years old, your body starts treating sugar like it's a personal attack. And I should tell you something important here. Stay with me. At that point, I still believed my kids were taking me to Cedar Grove Living Center just to look around. That's the phrase Megan used on the phone 2 nights earlier. "Dad, it's just smart planning," she'd said. "You should know what your options are." Options. That word should have bothered me more than it did. But when you're a parent, you spend decades explaining away uncomfortable feelings. You become an expert at it. Your son forgets your birthday. He's busy. Your daughter stops calling as much. She's stressed. Your grandchildren barely know your middle name. Well, times change. You tell yourself these things because the alternative hurts too much. I climbed into the truck at exactly 9:12 that morning. The dashboard clock in that old Ford runs 4 minutes fast because I never fixed it, and honestly, I kind of liked the illusion that I was ahead of schedule for once in my life. Classic rock played low through the speakers. Tom Petty. Something ironic about free fall in plane while your children quietly steer you toward assisted living paperwork. You can't make that stuff up. Derek called me before I even reached I-235. "Dad, where are you?" That alone almost made me laugh. Derek Long had never cared where I was a single day in his adult life. Not once. The man once forgot I'd had knee surgery until 3 weeks afterward. But suddenly, he was tracking my arrival time like airport security. "I'm driving," I told him. "Well, don't be late." Megan already got there. There was impatience in his voice, sharp, tight, like a man waiting for a bank transfer to clear. I noticed it immediately. That's the thing about spending 32 years investigating fraud cases for insurance companies and corporate firms. Eventually, you stop listening to words. You start listening to rhythm, tone, breathing, hesitation. People lie with sentences, but they confess with timing. By the time I pulled into Cedar Grove's parking lot, the sky had turned the dull gray color Iowa specializes in around fall. The building itself looked nicer than I expected. Brick exterior, white columns, landscaping that screamed someone overpaid a contractor. The sign out front said Cedar Grove Living Center Comfort Care Community, which sounds lovely until you realize every place like that smells faintly like disinfectant and canned peas. I parked beside a beige Buick with a bumper sticker that read, "Jesus takes the wheel." Honestly, based on the parking job, he probably should have. When I walked inside, the warmth hit me first, then the smell. Lemon cleaner mixed with cafeteria soup. Somewhere down the hall, a television blasted an old game show loud enough to wake the dead. A receptionist with bright red glasses smiled at me. "You must be Mr. Long." That caught my attention too. Not, "Can I help you?" Not, "Who are you here to see?" No. She was expecting me. I gave her a polite smile anyway. That obvious, huh? She laughed politely, the way employees do when they're trained to laugh at elderly people's jokes, whether they're funny or not. And look, I know how that sounds, but I'm not bitter about aging. Really, aging's fine. It beats the alternative. What bothers you is invisibility. People stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as paperwork. Megan appeared from around the corner wearing a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my first mortgage payment back in 1982. "Dad?" "There you are." She kissed my cheek quickly, too quickly. Derek stood behind her holding a leather folder under his arm. Navy blue. Expensive. The kind real estate guys buy when they want to look important in coffee shops. He shook my hand instead of hugging me. That felt strange too. You know that look people get when they're mentally 3 steps ahead of the conversation? Derek had that look all morning. "Come on," he said. "We already got started." Already got started. Funny phrase. When the meeting supposedly involved me. We walked down a hallway lined with framed watercolor paintings of birds and lakes. Every assisted living place in America apparently buys artwork from the exact same depressing catalog. Inside a conference room sat a stack of documents at least 2 inches thick. I stopped walking. Not dramatically, just enough. And I remember asking very casually, "What exactly are we filling out?" Megan answered too fast. "Just standard intake paperwork." Intake. There's another word that sounds harmless until it suddenly doesn't. Derek pulled out a chair for me. "Sit down, Dad. This'll go faster if we stay organized." Faster. Everything was about speed. That's what first made my instincts wake up. Greedy people hate delays. They hate questions even more. I sat slowly while pretending my shoulder hurt worse than it actually did. Small trick. Makes people underestimate you. Makes them impatient. The paperwork sat neatly separated into sections with yellow sticky notes marking signature lines. Too neatly. That bothered me immediately, because organized paperwork means prepared paperwork. And prepared paperwork means conversations happened before you arrived. I flipped through the first few pages casually while Derek kept talking. "Honestly, Dad, this place is great. They've got physical therapy, meal plans, social events." Social events. At my age, social events usually mean sitting beside another widower named Frank while arguing about blood pressure medication. Then Derek said something he didn't realize would stay lodged in my brain for the next several hours. He pointed toward the hallway and said, "When you move in here," then he stopped. Tiny pause. Tiny mistake. Megan looked at him sharply. But I caught it. Oh, I caught it. Because people accidentally tell the truth before they remember the script. Derek cleared his throat. "I mean, if you ever decided to move in here." I nodded slowly, pretended not to notice. But inside every alarm bell I'd developed over 3 decades of investigating fraud cases started ringing at once. And that was the first moment my instincts started screaming at me. I've always believed there are 2 kinds of dangerous people in the world. The loud ones everybody sees coming, and the quiet ones sitting in a conference room pretending they don't notice anything. That morning at Cedar Grove, Derek and Megan thought I was the first kind of old man. Confused, slow, sentimental enough to sign whatever they slid in front of me as long as they smiled while doing it. What they didn't know was that I spent 32 years making a living off people underestimating me. And honestly, that's probably the funniest part of this whole mess. I adjusted my reading glasses slowly and pulled the first packet closer while Derek stood beside me pretending to be relaxed. He wasn't relaxed. His right foot kept bouncing. Tiny movement, fast rhythm, anxiety. People think lying is about words, but it's not. It's about body language, timing, breathing. The little unconscious glitches humans can't control when they want something too badly. And Derek wanted something badly. "Everything's pretty standard," he said casually. That word again. Standard. You know what I learned after decades working fraud investigations? Nobody says something is standard unless they're worried you'll realize it isn't. I flipped through the first few pages carefully. Medical release forms, insurance transfer authorization, emergency contact information. Then I found the first thing that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up: a trust amendment. Now, if you've never dealt with estate paperwork before, trust amendments look painfully boring. Dense legal language, tiny font, paragraphs designed by people who probably hate sunlight. But I used to review financial fraud cases involving documents exactly like these. Back in 1998, I uncovered a $3 million insurance scam because a guy used two different black ink pens on the same signature page. That's not a joke, by the way. Human beings are terrible criminals when they're impatient. I kept my face neutral while reading. That's important. You never show your cards early, especially not to your own children. Megan leaned forward beside me, perfume drifting across the table. Vanilla and something floral. Expensive. The kind of perfume people buy when they want strangers to think their lives are more organized than they actually are. "You okay, Dad?" she asked softly. Soft voice, careful voice, but her eyes kept darting toward the signature lines. Not toward me, toward the signatures. That told me everything. I smiled faintly. "Oh, I'm fine," I said. "Just slower than I used to be." That line relaxed both of them immediately. See, greedy people love hearing that. Slower, weak, tired. It comforts them. Meanwhile, I was mentally dissecting every page in front of me. The trust amendment transferred temporary financial oversight authority under certain medical conditions. Nothing illegal about that, at least not on the surface. But then I noticed the wording: cognitive decline affecting independent decision-making. Interesting phrase. Very interesting. Because no doctor had ever diagnosed me with cognitive decline. Not one. I read that sentence 3 times while pretending to squint. Derek mistook that pause for confusion. "Big mistake. You don't need to worry about all the legal wording," he said quickly. "It's mostly precautionary." Precautionary. Another dangerous word. I nodded slowly while taking a sip of coffee that had already gone cold. And listen, cold nursing home coffee tastes like punishment for sins you haven't even committed yet. I set the cup down carefully. Then I asked the question that changed the temperature in the room. Who drafted these amendments? Silence. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds. But when you investigate lies professionally, 2 seconds feels like a fire alarm. Megan answered first. "Our attorney." "Too fast." Derek added, "Just routine updates." Different answer, different rhythm. That's when I knew for certain they hadn't rehearsed this part properly. I leaned back slightly. Which attorney? Another pause. This one longer. Derek scratched the side of his neck. Now we were getting somewhere. "You don't know him," he said finally. And there it was. Avoidance. People answer questions directly when they're comfortable. They answer vaguely when they're scared. I glanced toward Evelyn behind the reception counter outside the glass wall. She was organizing folders, but watching the room in that subtle Midwestern way where people pretend not to notice tension while noticing absolutely everything. She caught my eye briefly, then looked away. But I could tell. She felt it too. Something was off. I flipped another page, then another, and suddenly I saw it. The witness signature. Now stay with me here because this part matters. Most people never pay attention to witness signatures. They glance at them the same way people glance at terms and conditions before clicking accept. But witness signatures tell stories. This one told a very bad story. The handwriting pressure didn't match the printed initials beside it. Different pen angle, different speed. And the county stamp was from Polk County, even though the notarized timestamp listed Warren County processing hours. That overlap was impossible. Not unlikely. Impossible. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not fear. Disappointment. There's a difference. Fear is when strangers betray you. Disappointment is when your own children think you're stupid enough not to notice. Derek kept talking while I reviewed the documents. And Cedar Grove has excellent memory care programs. Memory care. Interesting choice of phrase again. I looked up slowly. "You think I need memory care?" Megan jumped in immediately. "No, Dad?" "Of course not. Too fast again. Too defensive. You know that look people get when they realize they stepped onto thin ice? Both of them had it. I almost felt bad for them. Almost. Then Derek made the mistake greedy people always make. He rushed. "Look," he said sharply, sliding the folder closer to me. "If we can just get the signatures done today, it'll make everything easier." There it was, the real priority. Not my comfort, not my health. Speed, efficiency, control. I looked down at the signature tabs. Yellow sticky notes marked nearly every important page already, prepared in advance, organized before I arrived, like they'd already decided the outcome before asking my opinion. Funny thing is, I might have reacted emotionally if I'd been a different man. But working fraud cases changes you. You stop reacting emotionally because emotion clouds detail, and detail is where truth lives. I remember one case in Omaha back in 2007. Guy stole nearly $2 million through fake medical claims. Everybody missed it for months. You know how I caught him? He rounded numbers too neatly, that's all. Humans are messy creatures. Real transactions leave messy trails. Perfect paperwork is suspicious paperwork. And sitting there inside Cedar Grove, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights, while my son tried rushing me through trust amendments, I realized something important. This plan had been building for a while. Months, maybe longer. Which meant Derek and Megan hadn't suddenly become greedy overnight. No. Greed grows slowly, quietly, like mold behind wallpaper. You don't notice it until the damage starts showing through. I placed the papers down carefully and removed my glasses. Then I looked directly at Derek for the first time all morning. Not as his father, as an investigator. And I watched something flicker across his face. Panic. Tiny. Fast. But definitely there. Because deep down, he knew. He knew I'd seen something. Maybe not everything yet, but enough. And that's when Derek made the mistake greedy people always make. He started rushing. You ever sit across from your own children and suddenly realize you're remembering two completely different versions of them at the same time? That's what happened to me sitting in that conference room at Cedar Grove. On one side of my brain, I saw Derek at 9 years old wearing a Chicago Cubs cap, 3 sizes too big for his head, while crying because he struck out at Little League practice. On the other side, I saw 41-year-old Derek tapping his pen impatiently while trying to rush his father into signing trust amendments. Funny how life works like that. The human brain keeps old photographs alive long after reality changes. I leaned back slowly in my chair while Megan reorganized the paperwork for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. That's another thing nervous people do, by the way. They touch objects constantly, straighten stacks, adjust sleeves, fix watches that don't need fixing. Their bodies start looking for control wherever they can find it. Meanwhile, I just sat there quietly watching both of them unravel inch by inch. And honestly, part of me hated that I was noticing it. Because once you see certain things clearly, you can't unsee them. The room smelled faintly like burnt coffee and lemon disinfectant. Somewhere down the hallway, an elderly man laughed loudly at something on television, and for half a second the sound reminded me of our old house on Maplewood Avenue back in 1994. That house wasn't much. 3 bedrooms, brown siding, kitchen floor tiles I installed myself after watching 2 VHS tutorials and making exactly 14 mistakes. But it was home, especially after Susan died. Now I need you to understand something here. People always think betrayal begins with one big dramatic moment. It doesn't. It begins quietly. Tiny changes. Tiny distances. Tiny excuses. After my wife passed from ovarian cancer in 1997, Derek was 12 and Megan had just turned 9. For a while, the 3 of us became this strange little survival unit, trying to figure out life without the person who held everything together. I learned how to braid Megan's hair from a librarian named Denise at the elementary school. Not well, by the way. That poor child looked like she lost fights with electrical outlets for almost 2 years. And Derek stopped sleeping properly after Susan died. Wouldn't admit it, of course. Boys that age never do. But I used to hear him walking the hallway around midnight when he thought I was asleep. So I started pretending I couldn't sleep either. I'd sit at the kitchen table with bills spread everywhere while he wandered in pretending he wanted cereal. We both knew he wasn't there for cereal. Sometimes parenting is just quietly sitting beside your kid, pretending neither of you are hurting. I paid every bill I could, worked ridiculous hours, took private fraud consulting jobs on weekends. There were years I survived entirely on gas station coffee and stubbornness, but the kids never went without. That mattered to me. I still remember Derek begging for a Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card in 1995. Cost me almost $80, which back then felt financially irresponsible enough to qualify as criminal behavior. I bought it anyway. Megan went through a phase where she only ate Lucky Charms marshmallows and left the cereal pieces behind like tiny oat-based casualties across the breakfast table. Walter Briggs used to laugh every time he came over. "You're raising raccoons," he'd say. Walter had been my best friend since Reagan was president. Big guy. White beard, smelled permanently like motor oil and charcoal lighter fluid. Former Chevy mechanic. Terrible fisherman. Even worse cook. One summer he nearly burned his garage down trying to smoke catfish with a homemade propane setup. Told the fire department he was experimenting with flavor. To this day, I still don't know what that means. But Walter was there during the worst years after Susan died. He showed up without asking permission. Fixed things around the house. Dragged Derek to baseball games. Taught Megan how to drive in an empty church parking lot, which in hindsight was a catastrophic decision because that girl drove like she was fleeing federal authorities. And sitting there at Cedar Grove watching my grown children exchange nervous looks over legal paperwork, I kept thinking about all those years. All those ordinary sacrifices parents make without expecting applause. The school concerts, the dentist bills, the nights sitting beside fevers, the mornings waking up before sunrise to scrape ice off windshields before work. You don't keep score when you love your kids. At least you're not supposed to. Megan finally looked at me carefully. "You're quiet today, Dad." I smiled faintly. "You should have seen me during tax season in 2003. That confused her. Good. Confused people make mistakes. Derek slid another paper toward me. This one just updates beneficiary information. Just. There's another dangerous word. Nothing destructive ever arrives labeled destructive. It always arrives disguised as reasonable. I studied the page carefully. The amendment shifted asset oversight temporarily under specific medical review circumstances. Carefully worded, legally clever, and absolutely intentional. I noticed something else too. Megan wouldn't look directly at me anymore. Not for long. Guilt does that to people. They either stare too hard or avoid eye contact completely. Meanwhile, Derek kept over-explaining details nobody asked about. Classic panic behavior. "You'd still own everything." "Obviously," he said quickly. "Obviously." Another panic word. I nodded slowly while removing my glasses. "You know, I said casually I used to investigate a dentist in Omaha who stole insurance money by changing wording in patient files." Both of them froze slightly. Tiny reaction. Tiny but real. "He got caught because he changed words people normally ignore," I continued. "Funny thing about paperwork, the smallest edits usually matter most." Silence. Heavy silence. Megan crossed her arms tightly. Derek cleared his throat. And right there I realized something painful. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't one bad financial decision spiraling out of control. They'd discussed this, planned it, prepared it together. That hurt more than the paperwork itself. You can survive greed from strangers. Greed from your own children feels different, like finding termites inside walls you built with your own hands. I glanced through the conference room window toward the front desk again. Evelyn Pierce stood beside the printer organizing files, but every few minutes her eyes drifted toward our room. She knew, maybe not specifics yet, but she recognized discomfort. People who work in places like Cedar Grove develop instincts about families. They see who visits, who doesn't, who talks kindly to residents only when staff members are watching. Trust me, employees at retirement homes know more family secrets than priests sometimes. I rubbed my thumb slowly against the edge of the paperwork. Then I noticed the timestamp issue again. Same discrepancy. Same impossible overlap between county processing records. Sloppy. Very sloppy. And suddenly I understood exactly what had happened. Derek rushed the paperwork process. Probably pressured somebody. Probably thought speed mattered more than precision. That's greed's favorite weakness. Impatience. You know what destroys most fraud schemes? Not intelligence. Ego. People get greedy. Then, greedy people get careless, and careless people leave fingerprints everywhere. I looked up slowly at my children. Not angry, not yet. Just disappointed in a way that felt older than anger. Then Derek made the mistake that changed everything. He leaned forward and said quietly, Dad, we really need to get this done today. Need, not want. Need. There it was, the truth finally slipping through the cracks. And looking at his nervous face, I realized something that chilled me more than the paperwork ever could. My children weren't just trying to help me plan for old age. They were trying to control what happened after they decided I was no longer useful. And now I was done simply observing. I've noticed something about greedy people. The moment they think they're close to getting what they want, they stop pretending to be patient. That's exactly what started happening with Derek. Up until then, he'd been performing this polished version of concern. Calm voice, helpful son routine. Lots of dad were just looking out for you, but once he realized I wasn't signing fast enough, the mask started slipping. And when masks slip, truth gets loud. The conference room at Cedar Grove suddenly felt smaller than before. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that low electrical hum every office building in America seems legally required to have. Outside the glass wall, I could hear a medication cart squeaking down the hallway. Meanwhile, Derek sat across from me, gripping a Mont Blanc pen like it owed him money. "You're overthinking this," he said. That sentence almost made me laugh. You don't spend 32 years uncovering fraud schemes by underthinking paperwork. I adjusted my glasses slowly and looked back down at the trust amendment. There it was again. The clause. Buried halfway through page 7 beneath a paragraph about temporary healthcare administration. Sneaky placement. Professionally sneaky. The amendment shifted control authority if I became unable to maintain independent financial judgment. Now that phrase sounds harmless to normal people. To me, that phrase sounded like a loaded shotgun wrapped in legal language. I tapped the paper lightly. Interesting wording here. Megan straightened immediately. What do you mean, too fast again? Always too fast. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Well, I said casually, normally, these clauses require very specific medical evaluations before financial authority changes hands. Derek answered before Megan could. It's standard procedure. Standard. There's that word again. You know, during my consulting years, I once investigated a pharmaceutical executive in Kansas City who embezzled nearly $4 million through fake vendor accounts. Every time auditors questioned him, he used the same phrase, standard procedure. Turns out criminals love boring language, makes people sleepy, and sleepy people stop asking questions. I picked up the paperwork again carefully. The paper itself was expensive too. Thick, high quality. That detail irritated me more than it should have. Because when your children secretly prepare documents designed to control your assets, apparently they spring for premium paper stock. America's weird like that. I flipped another page slowly. Then I saw it. The beneficiary modification. And that's when my stomach dropped for real. Not dramatically, not movie scene dramatically. More like the quiet feeling you get when you realize somebody has been rearranging your life behind your back while smiling to your face. The amendment changed liquidation authority over my house on Maplewood Avenue. My house. The same house where Susan painted Megan's bedroom yellow because she said it looked like sunshine. The same garage where Derek learned to ride a bike by crashing directly into my recycling bins 3 separate times. The same kitchen where we survived grief together after cancer hollowed our family out. And now those memories sat reduced to legal assets on page 9 of a trust modification packet. Funny how paperwork can make a life look so small. I kept my face calm. That part matters. Because greedy people expect emotion. They prepare for anger. They know how to respond to shouting. What they don't know how to handle is silence. I looked up slowly at Derek, who suggested liquidating the house. Tiny pause. Megan looked toward him immediately. Bad sign. Very bad sign. Couples, siblings, business partners, whenever people glance at each other before answering it means the truth requires teamwork. Nobody suggested it, Derek said carefully. It's just an option. Option. Another dangerous word. I nodded slowly, like I accepted that explanation. Inside, I was mentally building a timeline, and the timeline looked ugly. The house liquidation clause connected directly to the temporary oversight amendment, meaning if they gained authority, they could potentially sell the property. Quickly, quietly, legally enough to create problems. I rubbed my thumb against the edge of the paper while pretending to reread the paragraph. Then I noticed something else, a timestamp inconsistency. Again. Now, stay with me here because this next part matters. The amendment carried a digital processing stamp from 8:42 a.m. in Polk County, but the notary verification listed Warren County office confirmation at 8:31 a.m. That drive alone takes nearly 40 minutes, meaning somebody either falsified timestamps or processed documents improperly. Either way, problem. Big problem. I almost smiled. Not because I enjoyed catching it, because it confirmed what my instincts already knew. Derek rushed this process, and rushed people make stupid mistakes. I looked directly at him. You know, I said calmly, county processing systems usually don't overlap like this. The room froze. Not completely, but enough. Derek blinked twice quickly. Megan's breathing changed. You know that shallow, nervous breathing people do when they feel trapped? That, Derek forced a laugh. Dad, come on. Nobody checks timestamps. Wrong answer. Very wrong answer. Because I check timestamps. Always. Back in 2011, I uncovered a workers' compensation fraud ring because one claimant accidentally uploaded medical scans before the supposed injury date. People think fraud detection is complicated. Usually it's just noticing lazy details. And suddenly I realized something almost sad. My children didn't know me nearly as well as they thought they did. They remembered birthday parties, fishing trips, Christmas mornings, but they forgot the most important thing about me. I built my entire career around noticing what other people ignore. Megan crossed her arms tightly. You're making this into something bigger than it is. That line hurt more than she realized, because minimizing concerns is what people do when they know concerns are valid. I sighed softly and removed my glasses again. At 68 years old, exhaustion feels different. Not physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, like your heart gets tired before your body does. Outside the conference room, Evelyn walked past carrying a stack of folders. She glanced inside briefly. Long enough to notice tension, not long enough to interfere. Yet. I watched Derek loosen his tie slightly. Another nervous tell. The polished realtor image was cracking now, and underneath it I could finally see desperation, real desperation. That surprised me. Then he said something that explained everything. If the house sits unsold through winter, the market's going to get worse anyway. There it was. The truth. Not concern for me. Not healthcare planning, money, property value, timing, market pressure. My son wasn't talking like family anymore. He was talking like an investor. And suddenly all the pieces locked together inside my head. The rushed paperwork, the trust modifications, the liquidation clauses, the urgency, the impossible timestamps. Derek needed something quickly. Very quickly. I leaned back slowly and folded my hands together. Then I asked the question that changed his face completely. How much debt are you in silence? Heavy silence. Megan looked horrified. Derek's jaw tightened instantly. Bullseye. You know that expression people get when they realize you accidentally opened the exact door they were desperately trying to hide? That expression? He stood up too quickly. Chair legs scraped harshly against the floor. Can we not do this right now? And there it was. Panic. Real panic. Because greedy people can fake confidence. But desperate people always crack eventually. I stayed calm, quiet, controlled. That's another thing investigations teach you. The calmer you stay, the more unstable, guilty people become. I picked up the paperwork one more time and tapped page 9 gently. Then I said the sentence that made both my children go pale. This amendment shouldn't even be legally valid. And for the first time all afternoon, neither of them knew what to say. There's a specific kind of silence that only happens after people realize their plan might be collapsing. Not loud silence, not dramatic silence, the quiet kind, the kind where nobody moves naturally anymore. That was the atmosphere inside the Cedar Grove conference room after I told Derek the amendment probably wasn't legally valid. Even the fluorescent lights suddenly seemed louder. Derek sat back down slowly, but the confidence was gone now. Completely gone. His tie had loosened slightly, and a thin line of sweat had appeared along his forehead, despite the room being cold enough to preserve meat. Megan looked like she wanted to disappear into the carpet. Honestly, part of me wanted to disappear too. Because here's the ugly truth. Nobody tells you about family betrayal. Even when you catch it, you still wish you were wrong. I removed my glasses carefully and cleaned them with the edge of my sweater while pretending not to notice both my children silently panicking across from me. That sweater, by the way, was one Susan bought me in 1996 from a JCPenney clearance rack. Still fit, barely, which either says something impressive about the sweater quality or deeply concerning about my refusal to buy new clothes. Probably both. Derek cleared his throat first. "We're trying to help you." There it was, the final defensive phase. When people can't explain the facts, they retreat into emotion. I nodded slowly. "I believe you think that." Wrong answer for him. You know that look people get when they expect a fight, but instead receive calm disappointment. That look. He hated it. Anger would have made this easier for him. Easier for Megan, too. Because then they could tell themselves I was being irrational. But calmness. Calmness forces guilty people to sit with themselves. And most people absolutely hate that. Megan finally spoke. "You're acting like we're stealing from you." I looked directly at her. Not harshly, just honestly. Well, I said quietly, "You did prepare legal authority paperwork without discussing it with me first." That landed hard. She looked away immediately. Bullseye again. Outside the room, I saw Evelyn pass by carrying a clipboard. She glanced toward us briefly before continuing down the hallway, but not before noticing Megan wiping tears from the corners of her eyes. Now listen, I wasn't enjoying this. That's important. This wasn't revenge yet. This was grief wearing a business suit. Derek stood suddenly again and shoved his chair backward. "We need a minute." Need. Still that word. He grabbed Megan lightly by the arm and both of them stepped outside into the hallway. The second the conference room door shut behind them, the silence changed completely. I exhaled slowly for what felt like the first time in an hour. And that's when something strange happened. I felt old. Not weak, not helpless, just old. There's a difference. Because sitting alone in that conference room surrounded by paperwork about your future care, your finances, your home, your independence, it forces something into focus you usually avoid thinking about. One day, eventually, other people start discussing your life, like logistics. That realization hits harder than any betrayal. I stared down at the stack of documents while the hallway clock ticked loudly somewhere outside. 2:17 p.m. I remember the exact time because that's the moment everything emotionally shifted for me. Up until then, investigator Lachlan Long had been handling things, observing, calculating, connecting details. But suddenly I wasn't an investigator anymore. I was just a father sitting alone while his children debated what to do next. And that hurt. More than the paperwork, more than the lies, more than the greed. You know what the worst part of aging is? It's not physical pain. It's realizing people start mistaking your trust for weakness. The conference room door opened softly. For half a second, I expected Derek or Megan. Instead, Evelyn stepped inside holding a fresh cup of coffee. "You look like you needed this," she said gently. That woman had the emotional radar of an FBI hostage negotiator. I smiled faintly. "You got bourbon in there?" She laughed quietly. "Only after 5. Cruel policy." That got another laugh out of her. And honestly, I needed that moment more than I realized. She set the coffee beside me carefully, then glanced at the paperwork. Not directly staring, just enough. "You okay, Mr. Long?" There it was again. That question. Simple questions become dangerous when kind people ask them sincerely. I looked down at the documents. Then toward the hallway where my children were whispering intensely near the vending machines. Finally, I said the sentence that made Evelyn's face change completely. "I don't think they planned on leaving with me today." Silence. Real silence this time. Her expression softened immediately. Not pity, concern. There's a difference. "Mr. Long," she said carefully. Then she stopped herself. Professional boundary. I respected that. But I could tell she understood more than she wanted to say out loud. She glanced down at the paperwork stack again, and that's when she noticed something important. The intake folder. Not visitor paperwork, resident intake paperwork. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Now she was connecting dots too. "You were listed for evaluation," she asked carefully. I nodded once, slowly, and Evelyn Pierce, 66 years old, peppermint candy in her cardigan pocket clerk at Cedar Grove for 12 years, suddenly looked furious. Not explosive furious, quiet furious, Midwestern furious, the most dangerous kind. She pulled the intake folder gently toward herself and flipped through the front pages quickly. Then she frowned. They marked you as permanent residency consideration. There it was, out loud. Official. Permanent residency consideration. Without discussing it properly with me first. Without my consent. Without even telling me directly. I stared at those words while something cold settled deeper in my chest. Not shock anymore. Confirmation. Evelyn looked back toward the hallway where Derek and Megan stood arguing quietly near the vending machine. Then she lowered her voice. Did you know about this beforehand? I shook my head once. Nope. That single word seemed to genuinely upset her. Because here's something people don't talk about enough. Employees at places like Cedar Grove see abandonment happen all the time. Families arrive smiling, then slowly disappear. Visits become shorter, calls become rarer, and eventually residents start waiting near windows for people who stopped coming months ago. Evelyn had probably watched that cycle destroy dozens of people already, maybe hundreds. She closed the intake folder carefully. Then she said something that changed the entire direction of my thinking. You know, legally, nothing can proceed today without proper review. Now that was my language. I looked up slowly. What kind of review? And suddenly Evelyn, sweet, soft-spoken. Evelyn gave me the smallest little smile, the kind people give when they quietly decide they're on your side. Well, she said casually, paperwork errors can delay processing significantly. Interesting choice of words. Paperwork errors. I almost laughed. Because, there were errors, all right. Timestamp inconsistencies, improper notarization sequencing, questionable authority wording, and now a witness inside the facility noticing irregularities too. Derek and Megan still thought this situation was about convincing an emotional old man. But sitting there beside Evelyn with cold coffee fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and my children whispering nervously outside, I stopped feeling emotionally overwhelmed and started thinking strategically. Because once emotion settles down, that's when experience takes over. And experience was the one thing my children forgot I had more of than anyone in that building. You know what surprised me most that afternoon? It wasn't the paperwork, wasn't the trust amendments, wasn't even realizing my children had quietly planned parts of my future without properly telling me. No. What surprised me most was how quickly kindness from a stranger could stop you from completely losing faith in people. Because after Derek and Megan walked off toward the vending machines to argue privately, Evelyn Pierce sat across from me holding her own coffee cup like we were two exhausted coworkers surviving the world together. And honestly, that's exactly what it felt like. The conference room suddenly didn't feel as cold anymore. Still smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee, but less hostile somehow. Evelyn took a careful sip from her cup and glanced toward the hallway. They've been out there 7 minutes, she said quietly. I checked my watch automatically. 8, actually. That made her laugh. A real laugh, too. Not the polite customer service kind. You really were some kind of investigator, huh? Forensic accountant. Sounds terrifying. It mostly involves spreadsheets and disappointment. That earned another laugh. And I needed that more than I wanted to admit. Because tension exhausts people. Especially emotional tension. Your body starts acting like you've been carrying furniture uphill all day, even though technically you've just been sitting in a chair arguing about paperwork. Evelyn set her cup down carefully. I shouldn't say this professionally, she said quietly, but I've seen situations like this before. I looked at her. Not shocked, just sad. How often? She hesitated. That told me enough already. More than people realize. There it was. The hidden truth about places like Cedar Grove. People imagine retirement communities as cheerful brochures filled with smiling seniors playing bingo and eating sugar-free pie. And sure, some of that exists. But underneath, there's another reality nobody advertises. Families struggling with guilt, money, burnout, inheritance tension, Adult children quietly deciding when their parents stop being independent enough to deserve control over their own lives. And apparently Evelyn had front row seats to all of it for years. She folded her hands together carefully. The good families ask questions, she said softly. The bad ones rush. That sentence sat heavy in the room. Because Derek rushed everything today. The paperwork, the explanations, the signatures. Even the fake concern felt rushed. Greed hates patience. I leaned back slowly. You know what the funny part is? What? I probably would have discussed retirement planning if they'd just talked to me honestly. That part was true. I wasn't some stubborn old cowboy refusing reality. My knees sounded like microwave popcorn every morning. I understood aging perfectly well. But there's a difference between discussing your future and getting ambushed by legal paperwork while your children act like you're too old to notice. Evelyn nodded slowly, like she understood exactly what I meant. Then she reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out 2 peppermint candies, held one toward me. I stared at it. You carrying emergency candy around at my age? That's called survival. I laughed harder than I expected to. Felt good. Strange how tiny moments save you emotionally sometimes. Not big speeches, not dramatic breakthroughs, just peppermint candy and somebody treating you like a human being instead of a problem to manage. I unwrapped the candy slowly while glancing toward the hallway again. Derek was pacing now, fast. Sharp turns, phone in hand. Megan stood near the vending machine, rubbing her forehead like she had a migraine. Good. Pressure changes people. And pressure had finally started squeezing them hard enough to crack the performance. Evelyn followed my gaze. Your son looks nervous. He should be. That answer slipped out colder than I intended. I sighed afterward. Sorry. No, she said gently. Don't apologize for being hurt. That one landed deep, because I was hurt. Underneath the analysis and calm observation and professional instincts, I was deeply hurt. There's no training for seeing disappointment in your own children, no certification, no emotional preparation. And sitting there across from Evelyn, I finally admitted something to myself I'd been avoiding all afternoon. Part of me still wanted Derek and Megan to walk back in and explain everything away somehow. Ridiculous, right? But that's family. Family keeps hope alive long after logic dies. Evelyn interrupted my thoughts gently. You know what bothered me most? What they checked, permanent residency availability before you even arrived. That sentence made my stomach tighten instantly, because that confirmed planning. Not discussion, planning. I rubbed my forehead slowly. Did they say anything? Mostly questions about transition timelines, financial coordination, long-term placement. God, I hated that word. Made me sound like old furniture. I looked down at the paperwork again spread across the table. Then suddenly another detail clicked into place. A small detail. But small details built my career. I picked up the intake folder quickly, flipped 3 pages in. And there it was. Emergency financial contact authorization, pre-filled, signed section tabs already marked, prepared before I even walked through the door. I stared at it silently. Then I laughed once, short, humorless. Evelyn looked concerned. What? They already expected me to sign everything. That realization changed something emotionally inside me. Up until then, part of my brain still believed this situation had spiraled accidentally. Miscommunication, pressure, bad judgment. But this was coordinated. And coordination requires intention. Outside, Derek suddenly glanced through the conference room window. The second he saw Evelyn sitting with me, his expression changed instantly. Panic, real panic. He whispered something sharply to Megan. Evelyn noticed too. Oh, she said quietly. He doesn't like me being in here. Probably because witnesses make dishonest people uncomfortable. That got another faint smile out of her. Then my phone rang. Walter Briggs. Of course it was Walter. Timing has always been his weird superpower. I answered immediately. Well, Walter barked loudly. Did they lock your old ass away yet? I nearly choked laughing. Evelyn covered her mouth, trying not to laugh too. Not yet, I said. Good. Because I still need somebody who knows how to untangle fishing lines without using profanity. Impossible task. Walter snorted. Then his voice softened slightly. You all right, Locke? Now, there's a question only real friends know how to ask properly. Simple words, heavy meaning. I glanced toward Derek and Megan again through the glass, then toward Evelyn sitting beside me quietly pretending not to listen. Finally, I answered honestly. No, but I think I'm getting there. Walter was quiet for a second. Then he said something that stuck with me. Don't let people rush you when money's involved, especially family. See, that's wisdom right there. Simple, ugly, true. We talked another minute about absolutely nothing important. Football scores, catfish bait, whether Iowa winters were getting worse or we were just getting older. Normal conversation. And after the emotional disaster unfolding around me, normal suddenly felt priceless. When I hung up, Evelyn smiled softly. He seems like a good friend. He once accidentally welded a lawn chair to his garage floor. That doesn't answer my question. It actually answers it perfectly. That earned one last laugh between us. Then the conference room door opened. Derek stepped inside first, face tight, jaw clenched. Megan followed behind him looking emotionally exhausted. But something had changed while they were outside. The confidence was gone now, completely gone. And as I slowly folded the paperwork closed in front of me, I realized something important. By the time my children came back, I was ready for them. Derek came back into the conference room wearing the expression people usually have right before root canal surgery. Determined, sweaty, slightly aggressive. Megan followed behind him, clutching her purse against her chest like it contained emergency oxygen. Meanwhile, I sat calmly beside a half-empty coffee cup and a peppermint candy wrapper, feeling strangely peaceful for the first time all afternoon. That probably sounds odd, but once you stop wondering whether people are lying to you and finally know for certain, clarity becomes oddly relaxing. Painful, but relaxing. Derek shut the conference room door behind him harder than necessary. Tiny burst of emotion. Another crack in the mask. Evelyn stood slowly from her chair. Well, she said politely, I should probably get back to the front desk. But before she left, she placed a thin blue Cedar Grove folder beside me. Subtle move. Very subtle. Inside that folder, copies. Photocopies of intake paperwork. Bless that woman. I looked up at her. She smiled politely, but her eyes said something entirely different. You are not alone here. That mattered more than she probably realized. Once Evelyn disappeared down the hallway, the room went quiet again. Not peaceful quiet, dangerous quiet. Derek sat down across from me and immediately loosened his tie another inch. Megan remained standing for a moment before finally lowering herself carefully into the chair beside him. Neither looked comfortable anymore. Good. People reveal truth fastest under pressure. Derek folded his hands together tightly. Dad, he began slowly. I think maybe this conversation got off track. Interesting choice of words. Off track. Like the problem here was confusion instead of deception. I nodded casually. Seems pretty on track to me. That hit harder than I expected. His jaw tightened immediately. Megan jumped in quickly. We're just trying to make sure you're protected. Protected. There's another word people weaponize when they want control. I opened the blue folder Evelyn left me and slowly removed the photocopies. The second Derek saw them all, the color drained from his face. Oh yeah. Now we were getting somewhere. You copied the intake forms, he asked sharply. I raised an eyebrow. No, I said calmly. Cedar Grove did. Technically true. Best kind of true. Megan leaned forward suddenly. Dad, why are you acting like we're the enemy? That question sat in the room for a second. Because honestly, I didn't want them to be enemies. That's the tragedy underneath all this. I loved my children. Still do, even during this mess. That's the awful thing about family betrayal. Love doesn't conveniently disappear just because somebody hurts you. I sighed softly and looked down at the paperwork. Then I tapped one page gently. This section here lists me as a permanent residency candidate before I ever agreed to anything. Silence. Heavy silence. Derek rubbed his forehead aggressively. We were exploring options. Without telling me. We didn't want to upset you. That one almost made me laugh again. Funny how people always claim dishonesty was actually kindness. I leaned back slowly. You know what I used to tell junior investigators? Neither answered. If somebody hides information for your own good, it's usually for theirs. That landed exactly where I wanted it to. Megan's eyes filled slightly with tears again, but Derek was unraveling differently. Anger. Desperate people often choose anger because it feels stronger than panic. He leaned forward sharply. You have no idea the pressure we're under right now. And there it was, finally, real emotion, real truth, not the polished performance anymore. Pressure. I stayed quiet intentionally. Silence pulls confession out of people better than questions sometimes. Derek exhaled heavily and rubbed both hands down his face. The market collapsed on 2 properties, he muttered. Interest rates jumped. Investors pulled out. Megan stared at the table. Not at him. At the table. Which told me she already knew all of this. I nodded slowly. How much? Derek hesitated. Then finally, 480,000. I actually blinked. Not because I was shocked he had debt, because I suddenly understood why they'd become so reckless. Almost $500,000. That kind of pressure changes people fast, especially arrogant people who believe they're smarter than consequences. Megan finally spoke quietly. The bank's threatening legal action. There it was, the full picture beginning to emerge. The rushed paperwork, the liquidation clauses, the urgency, the manipulation. They weren't just greedy. They were drowning, and drowning people grab whatever floats nearby. Even family. I rubbed my thumb slowly along the edge of the paperwork stack. Then I asked the question that truly shattered the room. When exactly were you planning to tell me about selling the house? Neither answered immediately, which was answer enough. Pay attention to this next part, because this is where people reveal who they really are. Megan started crying first, quiet crying, ashamed crying. But Derek got defensive, instantly. We weren't stealing anything. No, no. He stood suddenly again, pacing now. We were trying to fix things before everything collapsed, by putting me into permanent residency evaluation without my consent. That's not what this was. I looked directly at him calmly. Then what was it? And just like that, he had nothing, because truth survives questions, lies don't. The room felt smaller again suddenly, the fluorescent lights harsher. Outside, a resident slowly walked past the glass wall, pushing a walker decorated with Iowa Hawkeyes stickers. Normal life continuing while our family quietly imploded over paperwork. Derek stopped pacing finally. Then he said the sentence that explained more than he realized. You still have equity, Dad. Still have equity. Not still have memories. Not still have a home. Equity. Financial language. Investor language. He wasn't seeing my life anymore. He was seeing numbers. And maybe the saddest part, I genuinely think he didn't realize he was doing it. That's how greed works sometimes. It slowly converts people into calculators while convincing them they're still compassionate. Megan wiped her eyes carefully. We didn't know what else to do. Now that sounded honest. For the first time all day. I softened slightly, not enough to trust them, but enough to listen. Why not ask me for help? Neither answered immediately again. Then Megan finally whispered, because you would have said no, wrong. That's the tragic part. I probably would have helped. Maybe not with everything, maybe not blindly, but honestly, if my children had walked into my kitchen and admitted they were in trouble instead of trying to manipulate legal authority behind my back, I would have sat down and figured something out with them. That realization hurt more than the paperwork itself. Derek noticed my expression change slightly, and for one brief second, guilt finally hit him fully. Real guilt, not fear of consequences, actual guilt. Then he made the mistake that ended whatever advantage they still thought they had. He pointed toward the paperwork and snapped, "Well, if you don't sign, we're screwed." There it was, raw truth. No more pretending, no more concern, no more protecting Dad. Just desperation. And the second those words left his mouth, Megan looked horrified, because now even she realized the performance was over. I leaned forward slowly, calmly. Then I opened the blue folder one last time and removed a single folded document, a document neither of them expected me to have. The original trust copy. Certified. Time-stamped. Protected through my attorney years ago after Susan died. Derek froze instantly. Megan's breathing stopped completely for half a second, and suddenly the balance of power in that room changed all at once. Because now they understood something terrifying. I wasn't confused, I wasn't vulnerable. And worst of all for them, I had already prepared for people trying to manipulate my assets years before they ever considered doing it. I've spent most of my life watching people realize they've lost control of a situation. Some get angry, some get quiet, some start bargaining with reality, like it's a customer service representative who might reverse the charges if they complain loudly enough. Derek? Derek froze, completely froze. The second I unfolded the certified trust copy and placed it carefully on the conference room table, it was like somebody unplugged him from a wall outlet. Megan looked worse. Her face lost color so quickly I honestly thought she might faint. And sitting there beneath those awful fluorescent lights with paperwork spread across the table between us like evidence at a trial, I suddenly understood something important. This was the moment they'd been afraid of all afternoon. Not my anger, not my disappointment. Proof. Because proof destroys stories people tell themselves. I adjusted the document slowly so both of them could see the certification stamp clearly. Polk County. Original filing date. Attorney verification seal. Everything clean, everything legal, everything prepared years earlier after Susan died. Back then, my attorney Harold Benson had told me something over burnt diner coffee at Louie's Grill downtown. Lachlan, he'd said grief makes families unpredictable. Protect your paperwork before emotions get involved. At the time, I thought he sounded cynical. Turns out Harold Benson deserves several apologies. Derek swallowed hard. Where did you get that? I almost laughed. Derek, I said gently, it's my trust. That sentence hit him like a hammer, because for the first time all day, the power dynamic had completely reversed. Now he was the confused one. Now he was scrambling. Megan leaned forward, carefully staring at the document. But the amendments. Conflict with original protective clauses. I finished calmly. Silence. Real silence. Not nervous silence anymore. Defeated silence. I tapped the certified pages lightly. Any major authority modifications require direct attorney review and independent cognitive verification. I looked directly at both of them. Which means your paperwork shouldn't even have advanced this far. Megan closed her eyes briefly. And right then I knew. She hadn't fully understood what Derek was doing until things spiraled too far forward. That doesn't excuse her, but it explained her. There's a difference. Derek rubbed both hands over his face aggressively. You don't understand how bad things got. No, I said quietly. I understand perfectly. And I did. That's the ugly part. I understood financial desperation better than either of them realized. I'd spent decades investigating bankruptcies, fraud collapses, insurance scams, foreclosures. You know what almost all of them had in common? Nobody starts by planning to become dishonest. People slide there gradually. One bad decision. Then another. Then panic arrives. And panic starts justifying things integrity never would have allowed before. Still doesn't make it right, but human beings are complicated creatures. Outside the conference room, the hallway phone rang at the front desk. A resident laughed somewhere nearby. Life kept moving. Meanwhile, our family sat quietly collapsing over trust amendments and desperation. Then the conference room door opened softly. Harold Benson walked in. 74 years old, gray suit, red tie crooked like always, still smelled faintly like cigars and wintergreen gum. And the second Derek saw him, panic became terror. Now listen carefully, because this next part matters. I never called Harold directly from Cedar Grove. Evelyn did. Apparently, while Derek and Megan were arguing near the vending machines earlier, Evelyn quietly stepped away and contacted the attorney information listed inside my original trust records. That woman deserves free pie for the rest of her life. Harold looked around the room slowly. Well, he muttered, this looks cheerful. I nearly smiled despite everything. Derek stood immediately. Mr. Benson, this is a misunderstanding. Classic guilty person opening sentence. Harold ignored him completely and sat beside me instead. Then he adjusted his glasses and reviewed the amendment paperwork quietly, page by page. No emotion, no drama, just methodical attention. The kind that destroys dishonest people psychologically because silence feels worse than yelling sometimes. Finally, Harold exhaled once. Then he looked directly at Derek. Who drafted these, There it was again. The question nobody wanted answered. Derek hesitated too long. Harold noticed instantly. Of course he did. Harold Benson had spent 40 years surviving Iowa probate courtrooms. The man could smell bad legal decisions from neighboring counties. We used a financial consultant, Derek muttered. Harold raised one eyebrow. Name. Another hesitation. Megan started crying quietly again. And Harold leaned back slowly like a man mentally preparing paperwork for future litigation. Then came the moment everything finally shattered. Harold tapped the timestamp discrepancy lightly. This filing sequence is impossible. Boom! Officially spoken out loud now. Not just my suspicion, legal confirmation. Derek immediately started talking too fast. It was probably a clerical issue. No, Harold interrupted calmly. It wasn't. That silence afterward felt enormous. Because once professionals stop arguing and start stating facts calmly, the room changes. Everybody knows the truth arrived. I looked over at Derek carefully. His shoulders had collapsed slightly, eyes exhausted, face pale. For the first time all day, he didn't look manipulative anymore. He looked scared, really scared. And honestly, that made me sadder than angry. Because no father wants to watch his child destroy himself, even when that child hurts him. Megan finally whispered, "We didn't know what else to do." Harold looked toward her, then toward me, then back at the paperwork. You should have asked him honestly. Simple sentence, devastating sentence, because it was true. That's what kept echoing inside my head all afternoon. They should have just asked me, not manipulated me, not rushed legal authority forms, not quietly explored permanent residency placements behind my back. Just asked. Derek sat heavily back into his chair. The bank's coming after everything. Harold folded his hands together. That still doesn't justify fraudulent processing. Fraudulent. There's the word nobody wanted spoken aloud. Derek flinched visibly. I need you to understand something here. At that moment, I could have gone nuclear. Civil action, fraud investigation, protective filings, professional complaints. I had enough evidence already to create serious legal problems. And Derek knew it too. That's why his voice cracked when he finally looked at me directly and said, "Dad, please. Just that. Please. Not polished anymore, not strategic, just desperate." And weirdly enough, that hurt the most. Because suddenly I could see the little boy wearing the oversized Cubs cap again underneath the terrified grown man. That's the tragedy of family. Even after betrayal, your memories refuse to cooperate with your anger. I stared at him quietly for a long moment. Then finally I said the sentence I'd been holding inside all afternoon. You thought getting old meant getting stupid. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Megan cried harder instantly. Derek looked down at the floor, and the truth settled fully across the room at last. Not just the paperwork truth, the emotional truth. My children had slowly started viewing me as vulnerable instead of capable, manageable instead of independent, a problem instead of a person. That realization wounded deeper than any financial scheme ever could. Harold closed the amendment packet carefully. These documents go nowhere, he said firmly. Final, absolute, done. And just like that, their entire plan collapsed. No signatures, no authority transfer, no liquidation process, nothing. The trap they built had snapped shut on themselves instead. But here's the strange thing. Nobody tells you about revenge. When the moment finally comes, it doesn't feel triumphant, it feels heavy. Because sitting there watching my own children break apart emotionally beneath fluorescent nursing home lights, I realized justice and heartbreak sometimes arrive holding hands. And honestly, that was harder than I expected. I drove home from Cedar Grove just before sunset. Same silver 2014 Ford F-150. Same cracked coffee stain near the gear shift. Same rattling sound from the passenger side door that Walter had promised to fix approximately 17 times over the last 4 years. But nothing felt the same anymore. You know how certain days divide your life into before and after without warning? That was one of those days. The Iowa sky had turned orange and gray as I headed west down Hickman Road. Trees blurred past the windows, their leaves halfway between green and burnt copper. Beautiful evening. Terrible mood. Funny how the world keeps looking normal while your personal life quietly detonates. I drove with the radio off. Couldn't handle noise anymore. Not after spending hours inside that conference room watching my children unravel beneath legal paperwork and fluorescent lighting. And honestly, the silence hurt less. My phone buzzed twice during the drive. Derek, then Megan. I ignored both. Not out of cruelty, I just didn't know what to say yet. Because what exactly are you supposed to say after your children try maneuvering you into signing residency and financial authority paperwork behind your back? There's no Hallmark card for that conversation. I pulled into my driveway around 6:11 p.m. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Brown siding, white shutters, front porch light. Susan picked out 23 years ago because she said it made the place feel less grumpy. Evening shadows stretched across the lawn while cold October wind pushed dead leaves against the garage door. Home. Still home. That mattered more than I expected. I sat inside the truck for nearly 5 full minutes before getting out, hands resting on the steering wheel, engine ticking softly, trying to process everything. And that's when the voicemail notification appeared again. 3 messages now. 1 from Derek, 2 from Megan. I still couldn't bring myself to listen, because part of me feared hearing regret, and another part feared hearing excuses. Neither sounded survivable emotionally at that moment. Inside the house, everything smelled faintly like cedarwood and old books. Comfort smells. Familiar smells. The grandfather clock near the hallway ticked steadily while I hung my jacket beside the door. Then I noticed something that nearly broke me. Susan's chair. Still sitting beside the living room window exactly where she always kept it. Blue fabric, slight fading on the armrests, little crochet blanket folded neatly across the back. I stood there staring at it longer than I should have, because suddenly the entire day crashed into me emotionally all at once. Not the fraud, not the paperwork, the loneliness. That was the real damage. You spend decades building a family believing love creates permanent safety. Then one afternoon, inside a retirement facility, you realize love doesn't always protect people from becoming strangers. I sat heavily in my recliner and rubbed both hands over my face. Exhausted, deep exhausted, the kind that settles behind your ribs. Then somebody knocked loudly on the front door. 3 hard knocks. Only one person I know knocks like he's serving a search warrant. Walter Briggs, of course. I opened the door and immediately got hit with the smell of chili. Homemade chili. Walter stood there holding a giant aluminum pot while wearing a camouflage jacket that looked older than several small countries. Well, he said, "You look terrible." That's friendship right there. I brought chili. Now that's friendship. He stepped inside without waiting for permission because after 40 years, people stop pretending formalities matter. Walter set the chili on the kitchen stove and immediately started opening cabinets like he owned the place. "Where are your bowls?" Same place since Clinton was president. Good. I hate adapting. Normal conversation. Again, normal suddenly felt priceless. Walter filled 2 bowls while I sat quietly at the kitchen table staring out the darkening window. Finally, he looked at me carefully. How bad I exhaled slowly. Pretty bad. He nodded once, didn't push immediately. Good friends know silence has timing. We ate quietly for a couple minutes before I finally told him everything. The paperwork, the residency forms, the trust amendments, the debt, the confrontation, Harold Benson showing up like an elderly legal avenger. Walter listened without interrupting once, just chewing slowly, occasionally shaking his head like a disappointed baseball coach. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair heavily. "Well," he muttered, "that's one hell of a Tuesday. It's Thursday." See trauma already affecting me. That actually made me laugh, a real laugh this time. Short, tired, but real. Walter pointed his spoon toward me. "You know the worst part. What you'd have helped them." That sentence hit hard because it was true, painfully true. If Derek had walked into this kitchen 6 months earlier and honestly admitted he was drowning financially, I would have helped somehow. Maybe not recklessly. Maybe not enough to erase $500,000 of bad decisions. But I would have tried. Because that's what parents do. even exhausted parents, even disappointed parents. Walter shook his head slowly. Pride ruins more families than money does. That one stayed with me. Because underneath all the greed and manipulation, pride really had poisoned everything. Derek's pride, Megan's pride, maybe even mine a little. Nobody wanted to admit vulnerability honestly until it exploded. My phone buzzed again against the kitchen table. Voicemail. Derek this time. Walter glanced at it. You gonna listen? I stared at the screen for a long moment, then finally pressed play. Static crackled briefly. Then Derek's voice came through quieter than I'd ever heard it. Dad, I'm sorry. Silence. Heavy breathing. Then I don't even know how things got this bad. That part sounded honest, painfully honest. I know you probably hate me right now. I closed my eyes briefly. Because here's the thing. I didn't hate him. That would have been easier. Derek continued softly, I kept thinking I could fix everything before anybody noticed how bad it was. Another long silence. Then the message ended with, I'm sorry we made you feel disposable. That word destroyed me. Disposable. Because deep down, that's exactly how the whole day felt. Not old, not weak, disposable. Walter quietly took the phone and set it face down on the table. Neither of us spoke for a minute. Finally, he sighed heavily. So what now? Good question. I looked around the kitchen slowly. At Susan's handwritten recipe cards still taped beside the refrigerator. At the old calendar nobody remembered to flip to October. At the house my children almost reduced into liquidation paperwork. Then I answered honestly. I don't know. And I didn't. Because winning isn't always clean. Sure, I protected myself legally. Protected the house. Protected my independence. But sitting there eating chili in a quiet kitchen while voicemail apologies waited on my phone. It didn't feel victorious. It felt sad. Families aren't court cases. There's no real winning once trust breaks. Later that night after Walter left, I stood alone on the front porch listening to wind push leaves across the driveway. Cold air. Dark sky. Quiet neighborhood. My phone buzzed one last time. A text from Megan. Just 3 sentences. I'm sorry, Dad. I should have stopped this earlier. I love you. I stared at those words for a very long time, then finally slid the phone back into my pocket without replying. Not because forgiveness was impossible, but because some damage needs silence before healing can even begin. And standing there beneath the porch light Susan picked out decades earlier, I realized tomorrow was going to hurt too. The strange thing about betrayal is that the world doesn't stop afterward. You still wake up, still make coffee, still take the trash bins to the curb Tuesday mornings. Life keeps moving forward even when your heart wants to sit still for a while. That first week after Cedar Grove felt exactly like that. Quiet motion. I'd wake up around 5:30 every morning out of habit, shuffle into the kitchen and stand there staring at the old Mr. Coffee machine while the house creaked around me. October in Iowa makes homes sound older somehow. Pipes tick. Floors sigh. Wind brushes against windows like fingers. And every morning for just a second I forgot what happened. Then I remembered again. That was the hard part. Not the anger, the remembering. I never answered Derek's voicemail that night. Didn't answer Megan's texts either. Not because I wanted revenge. Honestly, revenge already happened inside that conference room. The truth came out. The paperwork collapsed. Their plan failed. That part was done. What remained afterward was something messier. Pain. And pain doesn't disappear just because you technically won. Stay with me here because this matters. A lot of people online love stories where justice arrives cleanly. Villains exposed, hero victorious. Everybody claps emotionally while dramatic music plays in the background. Real life doesn't work that way. Real life leaves bruises even after truth wins. 3 days after Cedar Grove, I found myself standing in the cereal aisle at Hy-Vee, staring at Lucky Charms. And suddenly I remembered Megan at 8 years old digging through the box for marshmallows while pretending she was helping organize breakfast. I stood there in the grocery store looking like an emotionally compromised idiot holding cereal boxes while a teenager stalked yogurt nearby, pretending not to notice. That's grief. It ambushes you in completely stupid places. Later that same afternoon, Derek finally showed up at the house. No warning, no dramatic speech, just his black BMW pulling slowly into my driveway around 4:12 p.m. while rain drizzled against the windows. I saw him from the kitchen, and for a second I considered not opening the door. But I did. Because avoiding pain doesn't heal it. Derek looked awful. Not movie star awful. Real awful. Unshaven. Eyes exhausted. Wrinkled dress shirt like he'd slept in it. He stood on the porch with his hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets, like he suddenly forgot how human interaction worked. "I brought donuts," he said quietly. I looked down at the pink bakery box. Bribery desperation. At least he was honest now. That was progress. I let him inside. And listen, the silence between us walking into that kitchen felt heavier than any argument we'd had at Cedar Grove. Because anger is loud. Shame is quiet. I made coffee while Derek sat at the kitchen table staring at his hands. Finally, he said, "I lost the properties." I nodded once. Figured that already. "The bank's restructuring the debt," he continued. "I'm probably going to have to file bankruptcy on 2 LLCs. There it was. The collapse. And suddenly he didn't sound arrogant anymore. Just tired. Very tired. I handed him coffee silently. Then we sat there listening to rain tap against the windows. "You know what scares me most?" he asked eventually. I didn't answer. "Not losing money." He swallowed hard. "It's realizing I started seeing everything like numbers." That sentence hit me deep because it was true. Not just about him, about all of us sometimes. The world trains people to measure value constantly. Net worth, property value, productivity, efficiency. And somewhere along the way, people start accidentally applying financial logic to human beings too. That's the poison underneath stories like this. Not just greed, dehumanization. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "You made me feel like paperwork, Derek." He closed his eyes instantly when I said that, like physically hearing it hurt. "Good. Sometimes pain teaches lessons apologies can't." "I know," he whispered. Then quietly, genuinely, "I'm ashamed of myself." And for the first time since Cedar Grove, I believed him. Now that didn't magically repair everything. Trust doesn't grow back overnight like movie endings pretend, but it mattered. Honesty mattered. About an hour later, Megan called. Speakerphone. She sounded exhausted too, crying softly almost immediately. "I should have stopped it sooner," she kept saying. And honestly, that was probably true. I think Megan got swept into Derek's panic gradually. Debt pressure, fear, pride. Family momentum. Again, not an excuse, just reality. Human beings are complicated, especially scared human beings. We talked for almost 40 minutes that evening, not solving things, just talking honestly for the first time in months, maybe years. And somewhere during that conversation, I realized something uncomfortable about myself too. I had been lonely long before Cedar Grove. I just hadn't admitted it. After Susan died, I became emotionally self-sufficient to a fault. Handled everything myself, never wanted to burden the kids, never talked about getting older honestly. That silence created distance too. Not equal blame, never equal blame, but distance nonetheless. You know, pride works both ways sometimes. A week later, Evelyn Pierce mailed me a handwritten note. Actual handwritten note. Who even does that anymore? Inside was a short message. "Thank you for reminding me that growing older does not mean giving up dignity." I kept that note. Still have it tucked inside my desk drawer. Because dignity really was the heart of everything that happened at Cedar Grove. Not money, not property. Dignity. The right to be spoken to honestly. The right to remain human even while aging. The right not to become invisible simply because your hair turns gray. And maybe that's the lesson I need you to hear most. I need you to understand something. One day, if life is kind enough, every single one of us will grow old. And when that happens, we won't just need medication or assistance or paperwork. We'll need respect, patience, honesty. We'll need people who still see us as complete human beings instead of obstacles, responsibilities, or future inheritance calculations. Because aging is strange. Inside, you still feel like yourself. Still remember your first heartbreak. Still laugh at stupid jokes. Still get embarrassed. Still love deeply. The outside changes faster than the inside does, and families forget that sometimes. So if you're listening to this story while your parents are still alive, call them. Really talk to them. Not rushed conversations, not obligation conversations, real ones. And if you're the parent in this situation, don't surrender your voice just because the world starts speaking over you. Pay attention. Ask questions. Protect your dignity, because trust matters. But informed trust matters more. And one last thing before I go. Despite everything that happened, I still love my children. That's the complicated truth nobody can simplify for YouTube comments. Love survived. Trust got damaged. Healing started slowly. And maybe that's enough for now. Not perfect, but real. If this story meant something to you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been in a situation like this? We read every single one. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.